Welcome back to another episode of the Styleframe Saturdays podcast, where great motion design starts with one favorite frame and the fresh ideas behind it. I'm your host, Caroline Lee, and today we're joined by Joe Basile, aka The Chicken. Joe, thank you so much for joining me on the show. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Happy to have you here. Well, before we dive into the project portion of the show, I'd love for our audience to learn a little bit more about you first. So for anyone who may be unfamiliar with you and your work, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into audio production?
Wow, it's kind of a meandering story. I guess first of all, I am the chicken. I always like to say I'm not a chicken, but I am the chicken. The chicken is my sound design studio and company. I always tell new clients, people that I meet, when people work with the chicken, they're working with me. That's kind of how I've positioned myself. So everything from bids, project management to execution, creative direction, all of that kind of happens from me. And so I do everything from original music, sound design, sonic branding, audio mixing, general engineering services. I try and kind of do a little bit of everything from stuff that's, the most creative to the most technical. In a nutshell, I guess if you can hear it, I can do it, is how I like to position myself. In terms of how I got into doing music and sound design, I mean, I started, at a young age playing saxophone. That was kind of like the first little bit that I had into doing any sort of music on any sort of structured level. I was probably 9 or 10 years old. Before then, I would play around with like toy keyboards and stuff that we had in the house. My sister played flute. My brother played in the band, I think, when he was younger. My mom was very musical. My dad was definitely into really good music. And so music was around growing up. But one thing that I often think back to is, and this does relate to, what I do today, is it was so often about not necessarily music itself, but the sounds inside music. And like, an example I always like to talk about is I would take my fingers and I would put one on the lowest key of this tiny little keyboard I had and one on the highest key. And I would just like go down the keyboard, getting them closer together. And eventually I would get to certain intervals that just like sounded cool. Like there was just something about them. And I wasn't really sure. And like some sounded more interesting than others. And, what I know now is like a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth or a major third or things like that. And so it was always, that's what kind of drew me into audio was, the way that things sounded, rather than, music itself. Although music, is very inspiring in its own way. I always felt, I often feel that music is a means of displaying sound. Like, like it's, that's how it's talked to me, or, how that's always resonated with me. So in terms of, how I got, into what I'm doing now, I played in bands growing up. I got into like recording my bands like with tape recorders or like with very rudimentary music software. Cool Edit Pro, I think, is what I was using, in high school, which is super old school. But so I started doing that, and I was always interested in computers and music. And so eventually I found a program at a in-state school in North Carolina where I grew up, Western Carolina University, where they had a commercial and electronic music program, where it was basically blending music and technology together. And what I really liked about that program is, like, at the time, most universities that I saw put their audio production program like in their communications department, or like in like some sort of like more technical department, whereas at Western Carolina, they put it in their music department. So one of the things that you were required to do is play an instrument, put on recitals, play in ensembles, do music theory, music history, like take all of these courses that are music related. And then you get into the recording studio and start taking classes in there. Um, and that for me was a really good way of just getting a good musical foundation. I just, yeah, I think that that education was just absolutely invaluable because it wasn't just learning how to twirl knobs. It was learning, why certain things sound the way that they do in a musical context. So yeah, I finished my bachelor's there. Um, right after that, I did probably like an 8-month internship in New York at Ant Food Music and Sound Design. It's a wonderful internship. I like to tell people, I think I learned more in 8 months than I did in 4 years of college. It was also like 2009, which was a very challenging time for the economy. And so, to be frank, I didn't really. I had some small successes at the time. I had like a couple of little placements here and there, but nothing where I really felt like I was kind of breaking through. So after I did my internship there, I moved back to North Carolina, and I kind of just decided, all right, I'm just going to kind of figure out another career. I'll wait tables, I'll bartend. I was living with my parents, and I just decided, okay, I'll try and do music like on the side. Maybe music is just not really, music and sound is just not really something I'm going to do full time. And I remember it was shortly after that I got a job at an architectural hardware distributor, which, as you can imagine, is just about as unrelated as you can get from music and sound design for advertising. And so essentially, I did that for a couple of years. I worked there for a couple of years. I was doing like estimating and project management. I learned this whole other skill set for a couple of years. And at one point, I just woke up one day and I was just like, I really hate what I'm doing. Like, I really hate this. And like some important context, I guess, is during this time between my internship and working there, I I was doing a little bit of freelance work. Like I had like a couple little clients, like nothing really big, like just like doing some mixes or like maybe doing music or working on a couple personal projects or things like that, where I was just kind of keeping that going because I still really loved it. I still enjoyed it. And so then after I woke up and said, I can't stand working. Well, I like to, in a nutshell, I was selling doors and locks. But yeah, I decided, after a conversation I had with a good friend of mine, Alex Smith, who's a wonderful, amazing percussionist and instrument maker. He was in grad school at the time, and he said, "Have you thought about like going back to school, like just going and getting a master's and like trying to just like pivot back into doing music all the time?" And I took the GRE 2 weeks later. I was just like, okay, like, all right, I'll do it. Like, and so I just decided, I just like kind of crammed for the GRE. I did decent on it. I ended up going to grad school. I applied for grad school where I did my undergrad at Western Carolina University. And it was really interesting. Once I started grad school, the like floodgates of freelance work just like opened up. Like it was really interesting, like how I kind of communicated to some clients like, hey, I'm going to be like going to school, like with the idea that, I would get back into music full time. My plan at the time was really to like try and teach, because I was still not like super convinced that I was going to like really break into the industry, into like, the commercial music industry. So yeah, the floodgates of freelance work just kind of opened. I was starting to do like a good chunk of work. And then yeah, I finished grad school. then I applied for a job at a agency that I had applied for before but never got in Raleigh, North Carolina. And they had an opening for a music composer and sound designer. Um, and I ended up getting the job. So what I ended up doing is after grad school, I taught for one semester, and right at the end of the semester, I started that job. I moved back to Raleigh. It was kind of convenient. I grew up right outside of Raleigh, so it just really kind of worked out. Um, and that was a great experience. It was hard. It was, a typical grinding agency experience, where we did a lot. I would say the vast majority of our work was for one client, which has it has its challenges, for sure. But I got a lot of great experience, working there for a couple years. Um, then I ended up leaving there to work at a video production company, where I worked there for about a year. I was doing field audio, which I guess is, if you know the guys that hold the fuzzy microphones, like that's what I was doing. I was still doing a little bit of music composition for that company, and doing some sound design work. But a lot of it was mostly like working on set, getting up at 4:30 in the morning for, a 7 a.m. call time, like that type of thing. So yeah, I did that for about a year. And I remember my girlfriend, my wife, at the time, we were having a conversation, and I was just saying how, like, I just feel like I really wanted to do more. Like, I just wasn't really, I just wasn't really passionate about what I was doing as my job, doing field audio. It was great because it was technical, and like, it wasn't necessarily about being the most creative. But it was, you had to get it right. You have to get it right. And like, that's a valuable lesson to learn, in, what I do now. But yeah, we were just kind of talking about that. And she just said, why don't you just try and start your own company? Like, we were, it's something I had thought about for a long time. And, I had a client that, I had a pretty good relationship with, and we kind of talked about it a little bit, and, they gave me some, inspiration. And, I just, it was like a couple weeks after that, I just put in my 2 weeks notice and crossed my fingers. And yeah, that's kind of, yeah. And then I started the chicken. That's kind of the 30,000 foot view, of that. Yeah. I hope that, I know that was probably super long winded, but
No,
yeah.
it was fine. You've been, and
Yeah.
then you've been the chicken ever since. So when was that when you first started your
That
studio?
was in 2018 is when I
Okay, so you've been
started
doing it for quite a while now. Yeah.
doing it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It was it was challenging. I had at that time when I decided I was going to start the chicken, I had an opportunity from a client to join their company. I had an opportunity, and I remember, and this was kind of like really kind of the biggest decision maker for me. Is I remember I was in talks with them, and one of the things that they said, they gave me an offer, and the offer was lower than I was making, at my current job. And I remember I said, okay, well, if I'm going to be making less, are you okay with me doing freelance work, like outside? And the response was, we would be okay with doing some freelance work, but I wouldn't want you to be working with this big name studio or that big name studio or that big name studio. And to be frank, I was kind of flattered, like, because at the time I didn't really envision myself like working for, some of these like household, like these, industry leaders. And I remember thinking like, gosh, could I really be working for them? And I just decided I'm going to try. And I actually, the studios, and I'm not going to name any of these studios, or the place I'm talking about, but I ended up working for just about every studio that they named, like within the first couple of years. And I was like, all right, I think, and yeah, it was a good decision. It was a good decision. I still have a good relationship with those folks. I definitely, it was just the type of thing where it was kind of some justification and just some, I don't know if they meant it to be encouragement, but it felt like some encouragement to just kind of like do my own thing.
Oh, for sure. Oh,
So
definitely. Yeah, no, and
yeah,
it worked out. I mean, it worked out perfectly in the end, which is awesome. Well,
yeah,
as you were talking about, sort of your, journey into the industry and your career thus far, you did mention that, you've touched on a few different things within sort of like audio production stuff, like, original composition, sound design, on the field work. You know, I'm sure I'm sure there are people in our audience who know all the differences between those. But before we sort of dive into sort of like your favorite mix, which will be the favorite frame equivalent for the audio side for today, but I was wondering if you could just briefly break down the different type of work that you do. Like, would you mind explaining the difference between original music, sound design, audio post, sonic branding, so on and so forth?
sure, yeah. So it's getting more complicated to answer this question, because I actually do. I remember in an interview, I think it was in the interview with that agency, I was asked, what's your favorite thing to do? Do you like doing music more than sound design, or sound design more than music? And I kind of answered with like, I don't really think of them as being like necessarily separate things. Um, I, you know, Kind of going back to what I was talking about, how like I feel like music is a means by showing sound. Sometimes music can um, act as sound design, or sound design can act as music. But to answer your question, I write original music. I do sound design. I do sonic branding. In terms of original music, writing a score for for an ad, for a short film, or a longer film. That's what I think of as proper original music. Sound design, everything from syncing sound effects to doing a mix on something, to sound design is really a kind of a catch-all term for creative audio. I think music is a subset of that in some fashion, but um, sound design, I think what most people think of is like cutting sound effects um, to video, to animation, things like that. So that's like the traditional sense, and I do plenty of that. Mixing, kind of is something I also do, which is really just making sure that all of those elements that I was just talking about, including voiceovers or dialogue, all fit together really well, and that they translate on any platform, whether it's your phone, your laptop, your TV, anything like that, your headphones. And then sonic branding, that's something that's become it's really started to get a lot bigger over the past few years. But that's really thinking in a parallel way to like visual branding, where you're designing systems and assets for a brand um, that relate to their brand, and their brand guidelines, so that when someone hears something, they can associate that emotionally to the brand that you're creating that sonic branding for. That's kind of the biggest way to, or the most simplistic way to put that, which I've done a good bit of that. I also have kind of started um, doing a little bit of like voice acting and things like that. I will do that every now and then. It's not something I really market a ton of. It's a lot of work to do, but it is something that like I've done a good bit of. Yeah. I also, general engineering services, something that I've done quite a bit of, especially since COVID, since, the lockdown and all of that. Recording voiceovers remotely over Source Connect, or similar platforms. That's like huge. COVID really kind of like opened that whole avenue up to my business, where, it used to be, some big name agencies, they would take a flight to New York in the morning, record a voice talent in the studio in the afternoon, and then fly back home in the evening. And it was like the most inefficient way of doing this stuff. So whereas now we just set up a Zoom call, I set up Source Connect with the voice talent, I record them right here in my space, and I turn it around like instantly. Whereas, before it used to take, a day or two. So that's been something that I've kind of started doing a good bit of too, which I enjoy a lot. It's a good break from the constant grind of having to be always creative. It's much more technical. It's kind of, I actually really enjoy that part of my work. Same with like mixing. I think of that as more of like a technical task also.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that there are similarities with sort of the visual side of these types of projects too. Like, it's really cool to sort of figure out the creative direction of stuff and figure out like what the tone and feel of a piece is going to be like visually. But,
Sure.
Once you start really just getting into sort of like tweaking keyframes or, tweaking colors or this or that, like it's meditative in a way that kind of allows one side of your brain to kind of just quiet down for a minute. And then, your brain's itching for that again. And then you kind of dive right back into it. So it's a perfect balance. So it's awesome to hear that that's the same way on the audio side too.
Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoy I kind of try and do a little bit of everything all the time. So that way I don't feel stale in any sort of, in any one of those kind of avenues.
For sure. No, it's always great to keep learning the trades and the skills of the trades and everything too. Well, keeping everything in mind that you just sort of laid out for us, I'd love to dive into what we're calling your favorite mix today. So could you give us an overview of the project that you're sharing with us?
Yeah. And, it was very difficult for me to choose which one. I've done so many different things that I'm so proud of, but I wanted to kind of show something that I feel like really does a good job of encompassing like a lot of different things that we talked about. But yeah, the piece that we're going to be looking at is called Crack. It was animated by Johan Eriksson, wonderful animator. He approached me. This is a bit of an older piece. It's from 2020, but still definitely one of my favorites, where I really tried to kind of use music as a way of sort of breaking the fourth wall with the story. It was in Crack, I really tried to kind of get inside the main character's head. There's this, the video starts with he's driving this car and he's inside the car, and it's like inside his head, he's like driving like a NASCAR race car. And so like music, I tried to just kind of like really amp it up. But then when we see the outside of the car, it's just like this dinky little like sedan looking thing that's like squeaking along. And I tried to kind of really play on that duality and that irony with the music. The other thing that I really tried to do is like when he lands, and he lands kind of like in his office, the music that's playing starts sounding like it's coming from his computer. So like, I try and kind of, and this is a technique that I learned from a professor of mine. His name was Bruce Fraser. He was a really, really awesome guy that really taught me quite a bit. But it's kind of a technique of taking music that starts as non-diegetic and then turning it diegetic. So if you're not familiar with what diegetic means that the music is coming from what you're watching. So like if you see a jukebox and there's music coming from a jukebox, that's diegetic music. And this is actually, it's kind of a technique that I tip my hat to, that they used at the beginning of Shawshank Redemption, which is like one of my favorite movies of all time. But that movie, the way that they start that movie is like such a perfect way of transitioning from non-diegetic music to diegetic music, where it starts with like kind of the title card, and then there's music playing, and it gradually, as it fades into the movie and it pans down to this guy, to Andy Dufresne's car, it's it sounds like it's coming from his car. And so I kind of tried to like implement that type of aesthetic into this piece, where towards the end, when the music's playing, all of a sudden he's like landing in his office, and now it's coming from his computer, like he's listening to it there. So yeah, that's kind of the high level explanation of my philosophy behind that piece.
So you mentioned that this is a piece that you worked on with Johan. I'm assuming it was sort of like just like sort of a fun project to jam on together.
Yep.
But I'm just curious, did he give you sort of any type of creative brief to like work with, or did he say, "Hey, I want to do something with you," and you guys just kind of started jamming together? Like, how did that all start?
He was a great person to collaborate with. It was a lot of just like, I think he gave some thoughts on that kind of duality.
Okay.
You know, I, I should have probably looked at the emails that we've shot back and forth, but I seem to remember that he had some thoughts on like when he's inside the car, it's like one kind of mood, and when it's outside, it's another type of mood, and like really trying to kind of have the music mirror that, that concept.
Yeah, no,
But yeah,
definitely.
he was really great collaborator to work with, though. Like he kind of just let me do my thing on it, which was that's always really refreshing when collaborators kind of just like they give input and ideas, but they just kind of let you loose on it. That's always my favorite type of project.
No, for sure. Well, and I think you said 2018 was when you guys were working on this too. I feel like that was like pre sort of like algorithm change too, where people were just, you'd post something, when people would be probably watching it on their feeds. And I think it was a time when, and maybe I'm wrong on this thought, I'm
It
curious
was
what other people say, but
it was 2020, I think, is
oh,
when we were working,
2020. Okay.
but I mean, I think that was still I can't remember when they really shifted the algorithm. I think it was it after 2020? I can't remember exactly when, but still.
Probably around that time. But all that, I mean, just all that to say that, like, I feel like things were a little bit more carefree. Now I
Sure.
feel like they're obviously a little bit tuned into more like, like we want to feed you something that you're going to watch and
Yep.
watch this and watch this and watch this. You know, it,
Yep.
that's just my feeling, at least.
Sure.
I'd be curious to hear what other people have to say about that too. But I feel like I remember that 2018, 2019, going into 2020 period, seeing so many people, especially in the motion design community, just like jamming on projects together, like just doing fun collaborations. And it was awesome to see. And it inspired me as a motion designer to be like, oh, like I've never heard of this. I've never heard of Joe the chicken, or, some other people in the industry, oh, it would be fun to kind of collaborate with them on something, in the future too. So it was a great way to, like sort of like get people's names out there, like to sort of showcase, hey, this is what I can do. So, I feel like it's a little different now, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah. I mean, I think things, to your point, like things back then felt like you could kind of just do whatever you wanted. And if it was cool, it would pick up traction. Whereas now, yeah, it's like you kind of like try and target these certain trends and try and make things go viral, and like just try and like really, it's not quite as natural and loose as it used to feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. And actually, now that we're speaking about this a little bit, I'm just curious to hear from you, like how does that impact sort of like an like audio storytelling? I feel like it impacts storytelling in general now because like, the attention economy, like, everyone's chasing,
Hmm.
like how does it impact your work? Are you approaching your work a little bit differently now that, people are sort of approaching these platforms in this way?
No, that's a great question. The what I think of in terms of how the evolution of social media and technology has affected my work. Instagram, gosh, I can't remember when they changed it. It was around 2020, somewhere give or take a year or two. But
Hmm.
Instagram used to be mono. Like you used to
Yeah.
not be able to have any stereo audio on Instagram. You used to compress it like crazy.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so like it was really kind of frustrating if you would work really hard on something and then it was just smashed to mono. That was always like kind of a downer. So with that, increased fidelity there. Um, Also, phones are sound a lot better than they used to. Like especially in the last couple of years, they really sound a lot better. It's always funny when clients will say, "Well, if someone's listening to this on their phone, where like that's still something we do have to consider. Like you don't want to have like all the audio living, in the sub bass area of the sonic spectrum. Phones are actually like really like quite a bit better than they used to be. So that's allowed for a little bit more creativity with what your sonic bandwidth can be and what you're kind of playing within, whereas 1K is kind of like the happy place for phones, but like you can kind of get a little bit outside of that now. But yeah, in terms of like trends, yeah, I mean, I think short form content is it is just, it's way more common than it used to be. I feel like you used to be able to get away like crack is a minute long. Like now I feel like, if you want something to get like really popular, like it has to be like less than 30 seconds. Like it's and even still, like there seems to be like no way to really predict it. But yeah, I feel like that people want things that are punchy, that from the very start, especially like in consideration of like YouTube pre-roll, I think it's like 6 seconds or something like that they make you wait before you can skip. So it's like making it super engaging for that first few seconds so that someone doesn't hit skip. I've definitely, fallen into that trap a little bit. So, that's how I would say it's affected what I do from an audio perspective. It's, yeah, it's always changing. It's always changing.
For sure. Yeah, no, just the fact that we were sort of talking about those platforms just made me want to ask that question because,
Sure.
it's definitely impacting visual artists. And so obviously it's impacting you guys too, the audio storytellers as well.
Yeah.
Well, to bring things back to sort of the Crack project,
Sure.
when you were, first sitting down, getting ready to work on this mix, and you're collaborating with Johan, obviously. So
Sure.
obviously he has some creative input that he's relaying to you.
Yeah.
What was the emotion or like tone you guys were trying to convey to the audience that was going to view this? Like what were you trying to make them feel with this, especially on the sonic end?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of again like this duality of like this really heavy intensity. I mean, it's like, I think I use Moog synthesizer for, the bass and the arpeggios on the really intense sections of the piece. And then really trying to go the complete other extreme, which is just like very thin, squeaky sounding car. Like, and just really just trying to kind of add an element of humor when it's not it's not necessarily funny at first if you just watch it with no sound, but I feel like the sound really kind of helps to, elevate that humor. And then there's kind of a transition moment when the main character jumps out of the car. Um, it's hard for me to kind of remember exactly the genre. There was just something really kind of, I wanted to make it feel over the top. Like I just wanted to make it feel over the top. Like I was singing on it. I just imagined it being this big rock anthem. Like he's been so into driving this car just to go, like just to jump out of it. Like that's, and I just felt like, he's free. He's like, he's flying through the air. The wind is like, blowing his face. Like it's just, that type of thing. I felt that was a really, I wanted to add just this element of like, you thought we were over the top before, like, no, now we're really over the top now. That was kind of the main thought behind that.
No, I love that. Well, and it comes through. I mean, because like you're saying in the beginning, it's just this like heavy, sort of feeling in the beginning, and then you hear like the sort of like squeaking of the wheel when you kind of pull back and sort of that wide shot and everything. So no, the duality definitely comes through. That sort of intensity comes through. It's hysterical. I love it. When you guys were working on this too, and I guess speaking from the audio side of it, You had mentioned that, that sort of duality, or what was the term used with the Shawshank inspiration?
Oh, like the transitioning from non-diegetic to diegetic music.
Right, non-diegetic to diegetic. Other than that, like, was there any other inspiration for sort of the audio portion of this piece, or were you just purely just having fun with it, exploring, tinkering? Like, tell me what that was like.
A lot of it was just really just like having fun. Like that's when,
Nice.
and this is really important. When he sent this to me to work on, it was basically finished. Like it,
Okay.
and that was one thing. And I think about this piece a lot when I get approached with collaborations where there are so many things that will influence the tone of, or at least what I interpret as the tone of a piece. You know, from color palette to like the way that things move to like to the sizing of characters, the proportions on characters can make them feel more goofy, or they really play into a lot of this. And just the color palette feels very bright and like electric, like it just feels very like in your face. And so I felt like the music should kind of reflect that, and so that's why I really lean into a lot of like electronic instruments, synthesizers and things like that, just to kind of try and reflect that. It's often a challenge, especially when working on 3D animations, because those so often don't come together until like the last week, like the last, or like because render times are an issue, things like that. And so that's when it can be a really big challenge, is when you don't really know. For example, if you're trying to sound design a piece and, someone's walking down a hallway, just as a crude example, someone's walking down a hallway and none of it is textured. It's a 3D animation. You see a character, no texture. You see the hallway, no texture. And you just know they're walking down a hallway. Well, what are they walking on? How, is it stone walls? Is it, drywall that they're walking, all of these things. So often what I'll do with like 3D animations that I'm working on, I'll ask, can you send me some like fully rendered frames? It doesn't have to be the whole thing, but can you just like send me what you're thinking, just so that I can try and imagine what this is going to look like, so I can have some context there. It's obviously not as big a deal with 2D animation because that can get processed a lot more quickly. But with 3D animation, I always try and kind of, ask for that type of asset just to kind of guide the inspiration a little bit.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, and I love that you're sort of talking about sort of the workflow process of this too, because that was another question I was going to have for you too. Like, I feel like, I don't know if it's a misconception necessarily, but I tend to think of sound design as something that does kind of come towards the end of
Mm-hmm.
a project. But really, like, when should us motion designers and creatives in general, like, actually start thinking about it? You were saying, like, with 3D, because it's a longer processing time, if you could get some visuals earlier on to sort of get your stuff ready, that makes sense. But I'm just curious, like, should they be thinking about sound much earlier in the process? Can we share stuff with certain elements with you earlier in the process that can really help you with sort of the audio branding or the audio story portion of the project?
That's a great question, because I've dealt with it in all ways. I've come in at the very beginning, on a project, and worked on the project from the storyboarding phase all the way through to the end. Yeah, I mean, I worked on a piece a couple years ago that was for an epigenomic, I guess that's the right term, epigenomic tuning company. A genetic tuning company is what is how they kind of position themselves, where they were using music as a metaphor for this, kind of, manifesto anthem piece that they were putting together. In that case, I had to start at the very beginning, because like we concepted out, what is this going to sound like? How is this going to relate to, like, how is the music going to interact with the visuals, things like that. That in that case, I had to be involved every step of the way, every step of the way. Sometimes, if there's piece where you want it to have a specific tone, like a specific emotional tone, I think then that is when you want to bring a sound designer or a music composer in earlier in the process.
Mm-hmm.
If you know like what you kind of want it to feel like, then yeah, that's when I would say like it's a good time to kind of bring them in and just start getting ideas together. You know, temps are always, and when I say temp, I mean like a temporary piece of music that an animator or a video editor is using to kind of cut their piece to, just to have something to vibe with. That is always a great thing to do. What I often will tell people is, if you're going to choose a temp, or if you're going to use a temp, let me take part in choosing what you're going to use. Like, because there's a term called demo love, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, which is you have this temp music cut into the video that you've been working with for a month, and the client has heard it, and the creative directors have heard it, and like they're used to it, it's in their ear. And then all of a sudden you come in to write original music, and the temp music was like orchestral, but you really think that rock music would probably like work the best. That's an extreme example, but they so often they're wanting it to sound like what the temp music was. They want it to sound more like the temp track. And that's always a struggle. So bringing a composer or sound designer in early to kind of talk about like, okay, what do we think this should sound like? And let's find something that works, but isn't perfect so that they're not so married to it. Because sometimes you'll get something and I'll see it and I'll say, this is working perfectly. Like, I don't even, if it wasn't, a John Williams score, I would say you should just use that. But like, so there's definitely times that I've run into that, and trying to kind of fight with, trying to not copy the demo or copy the temp track exactly, but also trying to kind of keep the emotional tone there. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And cool. I know I've heard some studios and other freelancers in general more or less talk about how, like, by bringing you guys on earlier too, like it also gives them sort of like beats, which, I've experienced myself, beats to animate too as well. So yeah, no, I mean, I think when the opportunity allows to bring you guys on earlier, it's great, because I think it brings the whole story together, and, it influences our creative decisions too. If like the music starts changing, or some sound effect is really accentuated in one area, like, you really start to match the audio to the visual, like that much more intentionally,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, something else that I definitely want to talk about with how I approach writing music or creating sound design for animation, especially like this works really well with like extremely short form pieces, like, like 15, 20-second long pieces. There's like a visual term. I can't remember how it's pronounced, but it's Pareidolia. Pareidolia. I can't remember exactly. I almost want to look this up now, but I'm not going to. But it's basically, it's the same concept as you look at a cloud and you see an elephant, or you look at, the wood grain in a floor and you see a face on it. I experienced this quite a bit. I maybe more than most people do. I don't know what that says, but, and I kind of dabbled in visual art for a little bit, where I really I would take a photo of something and then I would illustrate on top of it, if I saw like a face in a tree or something like that. And so how does that relate to audio? Well, one of the things that I really like to do is, someone sends me an animation, and I'll just start, and I'm supposed to do music to it, and I'll just start literally just putting single drum hits on key parts of the animation, and I'll just have it loop. And eventually, if it loops enough, I start hearing like a rhythm with it. And this is where having really good animators, like, they have an inherent sense of rhythm. And so then I'll start hearing a rhythm, and then I just start building it out from there. and I'll just start layering other sounds on top of it. So it's kind of the same thing. Like you see a face in something that on something that seems, innocuous, but then I translate that into audio where I kind of start putting these seemingly random hits together, and it starts making a rhythm. There's a composer, Steve Reich, really kind of exploited this a lot with tape loops. There's a famous piece of his called "It's Gonna Rain," where he takes a clip of someone saying "It's gonna rain," and it loops over and over, and he manipulates where that loop starts, how long the loop is, and you start hearing different rhythms within that. Really, really interesting, piece. And, he was pioneer in that type of composition. But yeah, I think we were talking about when to bring in a composer or sound designer into a process, but I kind of went off on a tangent there.
No, this is great because it's actually, it's one of the other questions that I wanted to ask you too, coming back to the, this project that you worked on with Johan, you're starting to talk about sort of like the sort of audio decisions and the why behind those audio decisions for this piece. That's what I was curious about too. Like, how did you know, like, why to use this particular tempo or this rhythm or this sort of audio texture on certain areas of this project? And I think you're starting to talk about that a little bit, how you're sort of like, when I can sort of see the cadence or rhythm of what an animator's doing on screen, it kind of, that's maybe, I don't want to speak for you, but maybe informing some of your audio decisions as well. So yeah, talk to me a little bit about sort of those sound decisions too, like why certain tempos or why certain rhythms or certain audio textures in this piece.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's that you really touched on that perfectly, because the tempo, I'm almost positive in this piece, I'd have to go back and look, maybe cut this part out, but very often I will keep the exact same tempo all the way through a piece. Like, okay. I don't like tempo changes. Every now and then I will do it. But what I find when I keep the tempo the same, what might feel like, what at one tempo, an animation hit might come on beat 1. Mm-hmm. But in, at another tempo, it might come on the end of beat 3. And like it coming in on the end of beat 3 might feel a little more unexpected. Like it might. And so I try and more often than not, I will maintain the tempo, the exact same tempo the whole way through. I'm almost positive that piece stays the same tempo the whole way through.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And why would, if you typically sort of keep the tempo the same throughout, like what would cause someone like you to suddenly change up the tempo in a piece?
If there's something, if the action really, really dictates that, if it there's another piece I did by Hannah and Todd Chern, 2 animators out of DC, the DC area, called Night Lights. The beginning of that is very loose. There's not really even a tempo. It's very much more, just almost ambient in a way, because it's very introductory, at the beginning of that piece. And then once it kind of moves into the action, that's when the tempo really kicks in. So if it's so obvious and it really supports the story, then, I feel like you need to do that type of thing. But yeah, whenever possible, I try and keep the exact same tempo the whole way through.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and I'm sure that's the case with this piece too. And what I was also thinking about too is so if the tempo's the same and, that's not one of the tools you're using to sort of bring on like an urgency, as he's driving this car and it's all intense and everything, what are some other sort of audio elements that you're using to sort of bring out that sort of heightened tone and intensity and sort of just this, guy going crazy, speeding with this car? What other things are in your toolkit that bring that sort of emotion or tone out?
So there's ways of bringing, if you keep the same tempo, if your tempo's here, you have bump, 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 bump. You can go bump, 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 bop, 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 and the tempo stays the same, but you just change the energy entirely. Like, so there's that's what I try and kind of play on a lot. And I don't mean this to say that I will never change the tempo in, a piece I'm working on, but I just find that you can get some really interesting things to happen if you play in tempos that just aren't necessarily expected in a way. Like you can also just using that same example, like you bop, bop, but 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, you can subdivide it in different ways that all bring different types of energy. So that's something that I try and really kind of play within, that I think kind of adds a level of unexpected. It brings about rhythms that are unexpected when you approach it that way.
Very cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Well, you're talking a little bit about your technical approach and process now too. I'm curious, does the chicken have like a sort of signature workflow or a little, sort of little nugget that you put into every project that's like your signature thing? Like what's your signature sort of element or workflow when working on a piece?
Um, wow, that's that. I'm trying to think of how to unpack that. I would say I don't really approach
Could be a
any.
process too, like, just a
Yeah,
signature process.
a lot of times I will, if, for example, if I'm scoring a corporate piece, like a piece for a corporate client, I will look at the other stuff that they have made and look at how, what kind of music are they using, what kind of general aesthetic do they have, or sometimes it's to the point of, do they have one? Do they have an aesthetic? And if they don't, that's when I will ask them, okay, how do you want your audience to feel when they see this? Like, do you want them to feel energized? Do you want them to feel like heartfelt? Do you want it to feel, what is kind of the tone that we're looking for here? So that's kind of one bucket. I think I touched on this earlier, but when I have for a personal project, like a short form personal project, I will dissect the rhythms from that, especially if it's a really like intricate animation that's short. Like I said, it works best when it's short because then you can make them loop. But I'll just start putting hits on them. I'll just start putting hits on it and just seeing what kind of comes out of it. I make the best work when I feel like I'm discovering what I'm making as I'm creating it. Like if I know what I'm gonna make, sometimes I kind of box myself in. But if I go with my gut and I just kind of start seeing what comes out and just playing with different things, that's something that I really kind of, that's when I feel like I make the best work, is when it kind of happens on its own. As crazy as that might sound.
No, no, not crazy at all. A lot of other people have mentioned similar things that, like just going through the process or figuring things out as they go, like is equally and ironically like just a part of the workflow too. Like you do, and I think you have to leave room for that sort of exploration to let sort of things sort of organically come to. Like you can map and plan things out to a T, and that's, I mean, it's great. It's great to have a plan, right? But to let sort of like happy accidents happen that then influence some later decisions. I mean, like that's, if there was going to be a perfect middle ground, I think that's it, and a lot of people have mentioned similar things on their processes as well. So, yeah, no, that's great to hear that it's similar for you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was a piece I worked on. It was around the same time as Crack, maybe a little bit before that. It was in 2020 because I remember it was right before the pandemic hit. But it was called The Breakout, by Montas GR. Um, awesome animator, awesome collaborator. I've worked on a bunch of stuff, with him. And that was a piece where the first time I worked on that, let me start over. When I worked on that piece, it was the first time I tried a new approach, which was taking my synths and just making noise, noise, and I just recorded it for like 15 minutes, just like making all sorts of just in my head, the crazier the better, like just like the weirder the better. So just and I kept doing it, and then I brought it into Ableton Live, which is the software that I use to write my music and do some sound design in. I brought it in there, and I just told the software, slice this up according to quarter notes. Quarter notes were meaningless because I didn't do it to a tempo, but I just chop it in some way. And then on my keyboard, I was able to play all of these like seemingly like random little bits of noise. And that's how I sound designed that entire piece. That was something that, that was kind of another piece where I really kind of tried a new approach. That was the first time I kind of had tried that approach. And I mean, I think it did pretty well. I won a motion award for it, so I'm not
very cool.
Yeah, I'm not. I think it came across. That was another like a great example of just like letting it come out. Just let whatever happens. Like it's just and then just kind of cut up the noise from there. Yeah.
Very cool. I love hearing how like you're like technically sort of making these sounds and these compositions like come together for these pieces. Even with the crack piece, just how you're sort of like talking about turning knobs to like have you hear it from this side to then this side and like transition it from like actually coming out of the computer at the end.
Sure.
It's so cool. I'm like so fascinated with how you like pull all this stuff together. So, yeah. Oh my gosh. Like I know I'm certainly going to be considering audio a ton more at the beginning of a project. I've been trying to do that a lot over the past few years, like really start to think about like, what is this going to sound like too? Because I do think it influences the visual decisions as well. But just sort of hearing how you're pulling it together from a technical aspect or just like sort of a musical composition approach is just so fascinating to me. So thank you for breaking this stuff down for us today.
Of course.
Well, before I wrap things up, there are always two questions I have to ask at the end. The first is, like, what would you say was the biggest challenge and reward about working on this project?
The biggest challenge, I think, really getting that, like not being afraid to push that duality that I was talking about, to push that to the extremes. I think to the point, and I remember like we were going back and forth talking about, me and Johan, on making more contrast between the inside of the car and the outside of the car. And there was a point where I just deleted the music on the shots of the outside of the car. Like I was just like, how about no music? Like how about nothing there? And that was it. Like, that was and I find sometimes like those types of decisions are when like the best things happen is like, I'll sit there and be tinkering, like it's almost like the equivalent of like, if you're in After Effects and you're messing with like the easing on like, one shot for, 2 hours. And then you say, you know what, I'm just going to go to a hard cut. We're just going to cut out everything. We're not going to, and then that works, making those bold decisions, I feel like can be, really, really effective. So I guess that kind of answers both of it. That's what was a really big challenge. And that's what was really rewarding, was just kind of seeing like, a big kind of change like that work.
Yeah, no, I love that. Oh, beautifully said. Yeah, no, those bold decisions, they do pan out. So
yeah.
More often than not.
Yeah.
Well, and lastly, what about this mix makes it your favorite mix?
I think that it really just kind of exhibits so much of what I like to do in my personality. Like, I just think, just from spanning different types of music, drawing influence, from what I learned in school, just really kind of breaking that fourth wall with audio. I just feel like it was a really all-encompassing piece of, everything I really like to do.
Very cool. Yeah, no, and I love that you keep saying breaking that fourth wall. It couldn't be more true with the sort of sound design component of what we do in the sort of entertainment media, industries itself. So that's
Yeah,
awesome to hear. Well, Joe, I mean, I feel like I could talk to you for hours about this. I feel like there is so much more that we could talk about on this project too, but I definitely want to be respectful of our time today. So maybe we'll have to do a part two and get into really the weeds of like all the sort of like stuff you're doing on the synths and stuff like that. But
sure.
thank you so much for sharing your creative process with us today, as well as your favorite mix. If people want to connect with you to learn more about what you're working on, what's the best way for them to do so?
Um, I would say my Instagram is the chicken sound and my website is thechicken.net.
Awesome. Well, we'll be sure to share your information and links to some of the resources we mentioned here for our audience to check out. But that wraps it up for today, everyone. Feel free to email us at styleframesatpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear what you think of the show. And if today's conversation inspired some new takeaways, please drop them in the comments below. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and leave a review on your favorite podcasting platform as well. And lastly, come connect with us on social. We're on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again, Joe, for joining us today, and we'll see you all in the next one.
Thank you.